Can you die from shock? When a young woman learns of her husband's death, she goes through various emotions. She dies from shock. But the reason for that shock just might surprise you. Hello, listeners. Welcome back to a Literary Cornucopia. This is your host, Louise Morales, with another story for Women's History Month. The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. Knowing Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. It was her sister Josephine who told her, in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed in half concealing. Her husband's friend Richards was there too, near her. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Brantley Mallard's name leading the list of killed. He had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once, with sudden wild abandonment, in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the east. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who had cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young, with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it, fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white slender hands would have been. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under the breath. Free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely, and she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. There would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. And yet she had loved him, sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? Free, body and soul free, she kept whispering. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door! I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. Go away. I'm not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her. Spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. Someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Bentley Mallard who entered, a little travel stain, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of the accident and did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, but the joy that kills. The joy that kills. Can joy kill you? Let's take a quick look at the story and what it means. Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, first published in 1894, explores the complex emotional response of Louise Mallard after she learns that her husband, Bentley Mallard, has died. Because Louise has a weak heart, her sister Josephine and family friend Richards gently break the news to her, expecting her to be devastated. While Louise initially grieves, she gradually becomes aware of a new possibility: freedom from the restrictions of marriage. Sitting by an open window, she notices signs of spring, fresh air, birds, and patches of blue sky. These images symbolize renewal and the emerging realization that she can now live for herself. At first, Louise resists this thought, but she eventually embraces it, whispering "free" repeatedly as she imagines a future in which she controls her own life, body, and soul. Her realization is not about hatred for her husband, whom she acknowledges was kind, but about the broader constraints marriage can place on individual freedom. The story's famous ironic ending occurs when Bentley Mallard unexpectedly returns home alive. The shock causes Louise to collapse and die. Doctors conclude she died from joy that kills, but the irony is clear to the reader. Her death results not from happiness of her husband's return, but from the sudden loss of the freedom she had just discovered. Well, what can you conclude about Chopin's story? I'd love to hear your thoughts. When we go into details about Kate Chopin, we might understand where she's coming from and why she wrote this story. Kate Chopin, 1850 to 1904, was an American writer from St. Louis who began writing seriously after the death of her husband in 1882. Living for many years in Louisiana, she drew inspiration from the cultures of the Creole and Cajun communities, which appeared frequently in her fiction. Her work explored themes that were bold for the late 19th century, especially women's independence, identity, and resistance to the restrictions of marriage and social expectations. Through her fiction, Chopin examined women's desire for self-determination, emotional freedom, and creative expression within a society that limited their roles to wife and mother. Her most famous novel, The Awakening, 1899, tells the story of a woman's personal and artistic awakening. The novel's frank treatment of female desire and independence shocked readers of the time and was widely condemned, disappearing from print for decades before being rediscovered and celebrated in the mid-20th century. I'd like to point out that Kate Chopin died by suicide on August 22, 1904, in St. Louis, Missouri, just after the publication of her controversial novel. Today, Chopin is recognized as an important early voice in feminist literature whose stories challenge the social conventions imposed on women in the American South. Well, listeners, that's a wrap for this episode on Kate Chopin and her story. Hope you enjoyed it along with the discussion that followed. As usual, any recommendations or comments may be addressed through the podcast app or via email at aliterary@gmail.com. For April, as I had announced earlier, we're taking some time to appreciate Poetry Month. I've invited some listeners to contribute their favorite poems. Do you have a favorite? Until then, remember to keep the light of imagination burning. This is your host, Louise Morales, wishing you, as always, happy reading, listening, and writing.